good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We've had very distinguished precedents, but I can assure you have an equally distinguished panel. I'll very briefly introduce them because we have a very short time with you. The first on the far left, Bruno Bensasson, is the CEO of EDF Renewables. Dr. Anuragha Ghosh is the CEO of the CEEW, which is one of India's leading and most exciting think tanks in the environmental and energy space. Daniel Hanna is the Global Head of Sustainable Finance for Standard Chartered Bank. Karim Moussa, the co-CEO of EFG Hermes and the CEO of Vortex, which many of you will know is EFG Hermes' investment platform in renewables. Mustafa Siddiqui is a Senior Managing Director at Blackstone. And finally, Dietmar, I'll get his name absolutely right, Siersdorfer is the CEO of Siemens in the Middle East. We have a very brief time to spend talking about a very big topic, which is the potential, the opportunity for renewables in the global south. And I'll start with just the most basic proposition, which is that more and more we see that renewables is the cheapest way to deliver a kilowatt hour, whether it's wind or solar. We keep seeing prices going down for a number of reasons. And that creates an enormous opportunity, we think, for what's going on in the global south. And I'll start, Anuragha, perhaps you could set the scene for us. You know, what is that opportunity? What does it offer for countries that have many, many challenges, including lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? What can renewable energy offer?
Thank you, Harry, and thank you to the Future Sustainability Summit for having me here. Very simply, 40% of the world's population gets 15% of energy investment annually, and 15% of the world's population gets 40% of the world's energy investment annually. So money is circulating in capital-rich countries when actually energy demand is growing in capital-poor countries. That's really the problem we're trying to solve here. Now, where would renewables come in? At the margin, we now know, in country after country, renewables is beating thermal power in terms of levelized cost of electricity. So while we can continue to de-risk those investments to bring in more institutional capital, I think our attention also has to turn from the supply to the demand side. Where is it that we're going to start deploying these renewables? Where are the new opportunities? And I think if you scan the emerging economies and the rest of the developing world, you see that there are still many untapped growth markets. When we think about distributed generation, it's not simply one solar home system on a farmer's hut, but also distributed generation in residential areas of very urban, very densely populated urban areas in developing countries. That's a massive, in India alone, that's a 40,000 megawatt opportunity that is still being met only 10% of the road so far. The other area is how do we integrate a lot of these systems? So if you have distributed generation, you have the mobility transition, you need energy storage, you have massive cooling demand, say in this region or in South Asia where I come from. These need integration of the systems to balance the load, to modify the way the energy is consumed. So that's another area where developing countries can see a major role playing out. And the third main area is indigenization. I think we have to move away from this mercantilist approach that only a few countries should manufacture solar PVs, panels or wind turbines and so forth. Actually, if you think about the value chain, more than 60% of the value from manufacturing alone is coming from outside of the manufacturing of the panel or the wind turbine. So that's where there's a huge opportunity for local value creation, local job creation, and getting these economies to see that the green economy is also the driver of the economy in terms of new markets, integration of technologies, and local value creation.
Thank you very much, Anuragha. I'm just going to come a bit closer to you because I think I've taken more of the wrong podium. But Bruno, when we spoke beforehand, you gave me quite an optimistic picture of how things are going. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that. You know, what's going right? What do you see, in the markets that you're operating in, and what could be better? What would you need in order to do more projects and more megawatts?
Thank you, and thank you very much to the summit to welcome me here. We see renewable as really a dynamic market. Renewable, all in all, they grow by 10% per year. And if we look to the global south, it's 20% per year. So in a worldwide economy that grows at 3-4%, Of course, to benefit 10 to 20% growth per year is really very dynamic. And whereas in the 2000, 70% of the solar energy came into Europe, which is not the biggest continent nor the sunniest. Now really the heart of the growth is in the global south, with India and China, amongst other, accounting for 2/3 of the market. So it's really a booming market, and that's, I would say, due to the wonderful progress that Renewable have done, experiencing a learning curve those last years, especially solar, that experienced a 15-17% per year decrease in its cost. So now solar certainly is one of the most competitive source of power, with wind and hydro, which we are also developing. So all in all, I would say there are not so much bottlenecks. But if you look more into the detail, of course, there are some bottlenecks. For Renewable to develop, we need a sounded, I would say, regulatory framework. Such framework exists in many countries, obviously, especially in the Gulf and in the Emirates, where we are happy to develop, but not all countries have adopted such a framework. You need a strong sounded off-taker. Most countries benefit from it, but not all countries. Also, on the more, I would say, access to power, we still have 1.2 billion people not accessing modern power, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And for those people, we need other solutions like microgrids, like solar home system. And the development of those solutions, I would say, is not fast enough. But all in all, for the rest, I would say that renewable energy have those last year come from childhood to adult time, maturity time, and it's really a larger and larger part of the power mix. I don't want not to quote the fact that power is not all energy. We need more renewable in power, but we also need to bring this renewable energy to industry, to mobility, to housing, and that's how we will really tackle the fight against climate change.
Daniel, I know from my own experience that EDF likes a lot of debt in their projects. They also like it to be very cheap, as I also know to my own experience. What do you think needs to happen to bring bank debt to these countries? I mean, you were saying that there's appetite for some, but not for all. What tips the balance? What makes a difference?
Well, I think that's, I mean, let me start by just talking a very big picture. I think as a bank, and I think as other banks, what we're trying to do to really drive what I think is a very big challenge for all of us, which is how do we react to both the need for reacting to climate change and also to support, I think, sustainable development growth across all the markets. I think firstly, a very big picture, Stan Chart has committed two things. One, that we will fund $35 billion of new renewables over the next 5 years, particularly focused around emerging markets. And the second thing is that we have committed not to fund any new coal power projects, and to take that a step further, that we're going to take all our clients off coal by 2030. So we're very focused on helping our clients across emerging markets transition away from coal for precisely the reasons that I think we've heard, which is really now in almost all markets, and certainly within a couple of years, renewables will be a more cost-effective solution than a new coal power plant going forward. So that's, if you like, that's on the very big picture side. In terms of individual projects, I think we work with developers, with countries, to really try and understand how we can put in place a capital structure that makes sense, that delivers cost-effective power to the people that need it, and also allows the private sector and the public sectors to come in to deliver that. So in the UAE, we're very pleased to take part in the MBR and in Noor Energy, the $4.3 billion concentrated solar park there. We've done wind in places like Jordan, and worked in many countries across Asia as well. And I think banks can play many roles. I think we can fund directly from our own balance sheet, or I think increasingly what you're going to see in the Middle East and in some ways led the way by the UAE, is the move to kind of these mini-perm structures where the banks will come in at the initial construction phase, get it up to a certain level, and then move to a refinancing which may be a project bond. And I think there it gets very interesting because you can really bring in capital markets as a different type of capital to really fund some of these long-term projects. So I think there's a lot that can be done in established markets. Where I think the focus really needs to collectively come together is in some of these new frontier markets where actually there isn't even any kind of power in many cases. I think we heard there's about 1.2 billion. I've got a stat of around 800 million people that don't have access to any power across the sort of global south. And there I think we do need a combination of development finance institutions like the EBRD and others working with the private sector through sort of blended finance structures where there is a mix of commercial and development capital. And Standard Chartered has got a big focus on trying to drive those solutions, working with the parties represented around this forum.
You've had a lot of success in mobilizing institutional capital in developed markets. You've done that in Spain, I think, in France. What would it take to do the same in the south, in the more developing markets? What do you need in order to go back to EFG's home with capital?
So we started investing in renewables 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, we've invested $500 million euros in equity, 1.3 billion in equity and debt. And at that time, we raised a lot of money from Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund to invest outside the region. The reason for us looking outside the region, we were basically chasing long-term operating assets with long-term visibility on cash flows, government guarantees, through a feed-in tariff or a regulated asset-based mechanism. And we've been pretty successful in doing so. We've aggregated 820 megawatts net in Portugal, Spain, Belgium, France, and recently the UK. Then we bundled all our wind assets and sold it to JP Morgan last year. We made mid-teens IRRs. So we've been active chasing these type of returns with a risk-return profile that works very well for us. Now, answering your point around here, I think one of the things that are happening now, which is a change to the last 5 years, is renewable energy are getting in a lot of these markets to grid parity. And, although in the last 5 years you needed a lot of these subsidies, you don't need these subsidies anymore. And that's the new era of investing as an equity investor, how will you price, your long-term sort of cash flows and your returns? And we're seeing markets, moving more into corporate PPAs and merchant. And it's a new era, I think, but the cost of, producing renewables have went down substantially. So answering your question, I think, in this region, you need a counterparty that, gives you that right sort of creditworthiness and guarantees in place, whether it's a private counterparty or the corporate counterparty. And you need an element of long-term offtake PPAs. We have to, to be able to finance these type of projects, you need a 10-year, 15-year type of PPA to price it. That is coming. We're looking at the market, and we're looking to invest as well more south as opposed to in the north as we used to do.
Thank you. So, Mustafa, I think you probably have the biggest pool of cash of all of us around here, certainly bigger than my balance sheet. Similar question to you, but let me also put an extra twist on it, which is, equity returns on these projects can be, at least to me, very surprisingly low. I mean, I hear talk of single-digit returns, even in quite challenging markets. Is there a point at which, for global investors looking across asset classes, renewables will just not be attractive enough, and the prices will have to go up a bit in order to generate the sorts of returns to pull that volume of capital in?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it depends on who that investor is. I think certainly what we've seen in many markets, or at least some markets, in particular developed ones, is the returns on renewable projects getting lower and lower to levels that don't seem to make a lot of sense, especially when that's been concomitant, as Karim said, with an increase in risk. You've gone from having contracted cash flows to largely merchant or even fully merchant cash flows, which is a very different risk profile. And you're dependent on inherently uncertain merchant power price forecasts to come up with your future cash flows. So Now, the thing is, the market speaks, right? Clearly, there are investors who opt into that. How long will that, and obviously that's in an environment of kind of globally low interest rates and capital seeking yield. So how long can that go on? I think unclear. I think certainly if you talk to a wide spectrum of investors, there are those who will be scratching their heads and there are those who will be participating in those returns. But I think the good news is that it varies from country to country. The framework varies from country to country. And I think that the topic here is the global south. And I think there's value to be added. In some countries, renewables development has become highly commoditized. It's a cookie cutter process. There are literally hundreds of small developers running around trying to permit projects and flip them. In more challenging environments where there's more work to be done, more value to be added in the development to actually create these projects, I think that's where your more savvy developers and your more savvy investors can have an impact. But then there's a whole other range of factors that you have to consider as well, which is around the political environment, the macroeconomic environment, the compliance environment, the contractual and legal frameworks, and then the kind of efficiency of execution. And I think that's one last factor to bear in mind, is that the development timeline can really vary a lot from country to country, from project to project. And that also drives a lot of the investor interest, right? Investors have, the scarcest resource is not capital, it's time. And having, I think countries where there's a track record of successful and efficient execution of projects tend to attract more investors and more projects, because investors have confidence that they're not going to come in and waste their time or get stuck or take years before their efforts lead to fruition.
So, Dima, let me come to you finally and take us back to the sharp end of this, the things that go round and round and round, and the big boxes that bankers like me stare at on our site visits and don't know what actually happens inside them. The big story behind a lot of this fall in renewables costs is the change in technology. I remember when we were pleased to finance 1.5 megawatt wind turbines, and now people like you are producing 5 megawatt turbines. Have we reached a sort of maturity where there's not much more to come and it's going to be incremental, or do you think there are still some big gains to be made in wind and solar technology in particular?
I believe that we have, first of all, to look at the big picture. And when you look at the big picture in the market, then you see that we have to have a very reliable energy mix, and this depends on country to country. So what the size of the turbines or what the size of the project makes is really depending on in which area, in which country you are. And we have countries like Iraq where you have not at all a reliable power supply at the moment. There you need to have from the energy mix a lot of fossils still in the future, and they will add up then on top of that renewables. And then we will see also different sizes in renewable. Having said that this reliable energy mix is, I think, that what brings the power then to the people and to the industry in the countries. It's also very important to look on somebody that is supplying that. And as Siemens, we are proud. We have Siemens Gamesa, which is one of the biggest renewable player. We have more than 90 gigawatt installed in the world in terms of renewables. So we see, of course, a lot of big potential in the future. Most of the investment that we see in the next 3 decades will go into renewables, and their wind and solar will play the biggest role. And what we will also see, as I mentioned, a lot of development still in the fossil arena, not in coal for sure, but definitely also gas will be somehow a market in the future in many areas in the world. I want to draw your attention to one particular point, and that's where we believe things will also change in the renewables area. That's really storage. We talk a lot about storage, yes, in home size, utility scale. When you go to households, you have storage, but when you go to utility scale, there is still a lot to be done. And I think that's where we are working on now, also from a technology point of view, to make renewables a 24/7 supply. And that's, I think, what is the game changer then at the end of the day, to make renewables even more attractive. And that will also then change the terms of investment, because the projects are getting more complex, and that will also give maybe better yields and better returns on the project. And that's where we are working on. And one particular technology that I want to mention on that is really what is, I think, over the past year, also on the venues that we had here in Abu Dhabi at the ADIPEC and also at the World Energy Congress, we always talked about hydrogen. And hydrogen is a technology that we believe will change the world of renewables. It will be a storage facility, so it will be a technology which we can use to really bring it back to the power generation process, but it will give us new opportunities also. So we really can do sector coupling with hydrogen. We can use it for different purposes. And you can generate it out of sunlight, out of wind energy. And that will be something that will change the markets in Africa. That will be something that changes really in the global south, as we are talking in this panel about this. That will change the market. And it's a maturing technology. And countries like the UAE, but also other countries in the region, they can really use hydrogen as generated out of sunlight, for example. They can use it to generate synthetic fuels. They can use it to burn it again in a turbine and generate electricity with it, and really define new markets with that. And that's where we believe things will move on, and that's something which will also then drive development in the renewables technology. And then we will maybe see even bigger sizes of projects. And when you look at the last decade, I remember the very first World Future Energy Congress I participated here. At that time, nobody thought that solar technology will be really a viable technology in that scale that we see today. Today, the projects are huge, and I agree, the projects will get bigger also in renewables in the future, and the complexity will also grow up with all the topics that I mentioned, and that will help us to develop more utility scale technology, and that will bring power, reliable power, and cheap power to the people.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned hydrogen, because I think even 2 years ago, EBRD redid its energy sector strategy, and we almost didn't mention hydrogen. And I think if we were doing it now this year, we would be talking, a lot about hydrogen. It's something I hear more and more, and there was a big theme at the IRENA General Assembly. There were a couple of themes I wanted to pick up on, but before that, we have about 10 minutes, and I wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience for me to pick up on. A little bit hard to see all of you, but... Okay, let me then pick up on what you were saying about gas. And Daniel mentioned that Standard Chartered has decided that it won't invest in coal. EBRD made a similar statement 2 years ago. I've said the last coal project we financed was actually 2011, but in the way of bureaucracies, it takes us 7 years to actually put that into a policy. Do you think, though, that I can tell you that we are already coming under pressure not to finance natural gas. And I suppose, let me start with you, Dietmar. Do you think there's a case to be made that actually, people who are concerned about the environment should be staying away from natural gas in the same way that we're already staying away from coal?
I mean, natural gas is definitely a bridge fuel. It decarbonizes really a lot. I mean, we are all talking about decarbonization. How can you decarbonize? Still, when you look today at the coal plants that are existed, even if you don't build a new coal plant from now onwards, in 30 years you will have most of the emissions that come from power plants will be from coal plants. So gas will be a bridge fuel, gas will be used, and we need it also in absence of really good storage systems today and in large utility scale implemented. We will really have to have gas also as a peaker. Even here in Abu Dhabi, they talk now about peaking solutions, which they again need. And we have a lot of renewables installed here. So we will definitely see that gas will have its place in the market. And with the very high efficiency that we have today in gas turbines, you also do a lot in terms of decarbonization. Just as an example, here in the UAE, with our turbines that we have installed here, we are reducing the CO2 emissions of the whole country by 1.27% just by the power generation equipment installed here and by the technology. So this is happening all over the world, and I believe that gas will be in place at least for the next 1.5 to 2 decades.
And Bruno, would you agree with that? I mean, or if you were given the opportunity to solve a country's energy needs solely with renewables and storage, would you relish the challenge?
I think renewable are great, but certainly today they don't provide 24/7 power. So we still have to crack the flexibility topic. I want to stress that batteries have also done huge progress in the last decade, learning curve by 20% decrease per year. So I believe batteries will play a bigger and bigger role. Hydrogen, perhaps also towards especially mobility or industry. For the moment, pending those progress, where does the flexibility come from? We have 120 gigawatts across the world. Out of that, 32 is renewable, and certainly hydro.
Yeah.
Hydro remains a renewable, flexible, competitive solution. Nuclear, to a certain extent, can also give some flexibility. But for those countries that do not adopt nuclear, certainly gas remains the flexibility solution, and there are many across the world. So yes, it's part of the system. For the longer term, you said a bridge, a transition. Yes, for the longer term, I think we can find a no-carbon solution, and we should find no-carbon solution. Battery is really part of that for daily flexibility. But daily, weekly, yearly flexibility is not the same.
Yeah.
Your battery can find its business model if it discharge every day, not every week or every month. For that, we still need some solutions. Hydrogen could be one. Pending gas is one.
I guess the beauty of gas is you can turn it on and turn it off. So in peak, when the low capacity factors, when there is no sun and no wind, you can turn it on, and when you don't need it, you can turn it off. Which
a
is
bit
not
slower than hydro, but yes, that's true. Batteries also are very quick to react. You're right.
No, sure. I mean, and I think from our side, we're starting to look at some gas projects. But historically, when we looked at gas projects, we would have said this is a baseload plant, and our model assumes an 85%, 90% capacity factor. Now we're thinking, okay, well, actually, maybe this is a plant that's only going to run 40% of the time, but it'll run at that critical 40%. And I have to say that's a lot harder to finance. I mean, Dan, you're still able to finance gas, I assume?
Yeah, very much. And I think one of the things that I think is really important to stress is to take that country perspective. Because each country is coming from a completely different situation. So in very developed, highly concentrated, highly populated markets like in Europe, where they've already got very well-established grids and you can see large-scale projects being rolled out, I think you can have a very credible story about moving to a net carbon zero position. But in the emerging markets, and this panel is focused on the Global South, we are still talking about people transitioning away from coal and people who have no access to reliable power at all. And so therefore the importance of putting in place renewables, off-grid solutions, as well as thinking about the installation of things like gas as a transition away from coal, and the sort of decarbonization that allows becomes really important. So I think it's really important to have that country lens, and I think it will be slightly different for everything. But to your point, very much we can still fund gas.
And Dietmar, you wanted to add to...
Yeah, I would say also that the policymakers and the regulators in the countries also play a huge role. I mean, still we have in a lot of countries already very high efficient technology installed, but still power plants with very low efficiency, high carbon emissions, maybe old technology are scheduled. I think it's really also a matter of the policymakers to say, okay, we go for this decarbonization and we schedule different our technology which brings the power to the people. And that's something that we have to have also in mind. And also what we need to discuss is how will the CO2 policy be in the future? What is the price for CO2? And this will also drive the change in the energy system that we are discussing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what we see in the European markets is that in the last 2 years, the change in CO2 price is dramatic, and it's shifted the economics enormously, which is good, but at the same time, it's always a bit concerning because you rely effectively on an administrative decision to keep that price where it is. I remember, I mean, you were saying beforehand that you don't see any new coal plants coming in India, and that's a huge shift. But do you see that shift overwhelmingly to renewables, or will gas have a big role to play in the Indian power mix?
No, in fact, again, going back to what was being mentioned earlier, the story, of course, changes from country to country. The landed price of gas in India is very high compared to, say, this part of the world. And therefore, there's a huge amount of stranded gas assets. So what we are actually trying to do at CEW is optimizing for what the gas grid would do outside of the power sector. So, where could you substitute gas for coal in industry rather than in the power plants, and at what price? Within the power sector, we're really looking at a shift significantly towards renewables. So today, if you built a gas power plant to stabilize the grid, that power plant is going to be around for a while. And the way battery technologies and grid technologies are changing, the story is going to be significantly different within a decade. So does it really make sense? So I think from developing countries' perspective, you really have to think about, number one, energy access. What's the cheapest source for energy access? Second, once you've electrified a big part of your population, what are the sort of power, what's renewables beyond electricity users? And then third, you look sort of over the horizon. That's where hydrogen comes in, and you begin to substitute hydrogen or gas for heavy industries, hard to abate sectors, which we now call possible to abate sectors. If you're going to do that, you see a kind of a lifeline and a lifetime of energy transition evolving.
So we mentioned quite a few different technologies between batteries, between hydrogen, and then at the other end of the spectrum is gas. These are, compared to renewables, these are harder to invest in different ways. And renewables is often a very simple long-term payment flow. You don't have negative environmental issues. How do you see the challenges of getting long-term capital into these more challenging technologies and more challenging areas?
We've invested in gas-fired power generation in a few projects over the past decade and a half. Those are obviously, again, situation-specific, the country, the fuel mix, the need, where those plants fall in the supply stack, and require a lot more development sophistication than putting up a solar plant, for example, and will gather and then bring to bear that development expertise to try and find the best solution for whatever market is that we're looking at. The others, battery storage, hydrogen, we keep an eye on all of these. I think with batteries, the business model is, battery is a nascent technology at a utility scale. And the business models is still developing, and it's unclear. And I think it'll develop in different directions in different markets. So we're keeping a really close eye on that. And we've tended to be, I think, unlike some of our peers, we've tended to be quite willing to kind of step into newer areas. We built what was at the time the largest offshore wind farm in Germany several years ago. We built a hydro project in Uganda several years ago. We built the largest onshore wind farm in Mexico and developed, funded, built. And so it behooves us to monitor the various technologies that come up, because often there's an opportunity in the earlier days before the technology becomes commoditized. There's an opportunity to to provide some scale and sophistication to help deploy that technology at utility scale and help kind of prove not just the concept, but also the viability of the business model. So we keep an eye on them. I think the scale is still not there as far as battery technology the scale and business model, I think, is still coming. And then hydrogen seems to still be a few years out.
Thank you very much. So with several engineers on the panel, we have no choice but to finish absolutely on time. I took a number of very interesting things away from there. One is that there's good news, that this is an industry growing, an industry that's sustainable, an industry that offers hope across a whole number of areas. A second is about the importance of country-specific answers. A third is about the importance of a regulatory framework, that the right framework can attract capital from all sorts of sources. Just really leaves me to thank a very distinguished panel. Thank you for your attention. And just one housekeeping, I've been asked to ask you to be prepared to put your headphones on, because the next panel will be in Chinese. Thank you very much.